Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and along with me today is my friend. For the first time, I'm chatting virtually with David Pallmann. And for those who are in the niche of theological and apologetics discussions online, they know the infamous name of David Pallmann. And if you don't, you're about to, because this is a guy that I made friends with some time back and some years ago, and we've chatted back and forth, but he has just become a force for debates online, especially for a guy as young as he is. And I'm just so thrilled. This is long overdue. Please forgive me for not having you on already. We've tried to do it before, but David, welcome to the show.
You're much too kind, Braxton. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I mean, and for people that don't know, I've got in the description for this video some linked resources maybe that we've discussed, and I also am going to link a couple of debates that I found particularly helpful that David was in, because he does debate somewhat regularly on various platforms online, and I think, you know, one thing I discovered, David, when I first got into when I came back into the realm of apologetics and started the channel and everything, is I found that there were a lot of Christian apologists debating. There are channels where people just debating all the time, like underground rap battles of theology debates and apologetics debates. And our guys weren't always doing the best. And so when I see people like you, I'm really glad to see that. Do you get that sense as well?
I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said that there was nothing that he hated more than seeing a position that was important to him represented poorly. So I do sympathize with the grief almost of, you know, seeing positions that are dear to us, like our Christian beliefs, being represented badly. So yes, I can sympathize with that.
All right. So the reason I really wanted David on, other than just any old good reason to have him on because he's so cool, I wanted to have him on because David has a story that you know, he tries to stay away from this term deconstruction, I think, as a way of not to confuse people, but it's kind of like deconstruction. Jonathan Pritchett, my co-host, says, well, some of what Christians call deconstruction within Christianity used to just be called thinking about your faith. But you went through that, but you didn't deconvert. And so I kind of just want to hear you talk a little bit about that, maybe what your background was before all of that, you know, how were you raised? Because my understanding is it was maybe what some would class as a fundamentalist type background. So what was that like?
Yeah, so my father is a pastor in the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist, or IFB. You can't really call it church because they're very big on being independent. So, but kind of that niche of the Christian world. And yeah, you're
saying they resist the term denomination, right?
Yeah, they will reject that term out of hand, and they'll say that, you know, they're not. They'll say that they're independent. That's questionable in some factions, but ostensibly there's not any like hierarchy over the churches who are kind of part of it. But those who are familiar with it will know some things about that. But yeah, my father pastors in that. I'll call it a denomination, even though they would not like that term. And so I was always, you know, raised with very conservative, you know, views and values on, general Christian stuff. I had a good understanding of the Bible, like that, you know, general like Bible survey. You know, I had a pretty good understanding of that and Christian doctrine. I wouldn't say I had like a rigorous understanding of it, but I knew, you know, basic stuff enough to not fall into patent heresy. That this probably was a pretty standard pastor's kid's upbringing for that wing of the Christian world.
Well, you know, similarly, you know, I was raised the son of a pastor of a very large church, and it was Southern Baptist. But for those people you're talking about who know the distinctives here, the IFB churches, not to be confused with the new IFB churches that are out there, but the IFB churches are very much like Southern Baptist churches, except for there's maybe a little more strict adherence to some things like the King James Version of the Bible and things like that. But doctrinally speaking, maybe a lot of them might not say that, but there aren't a whole lot of differences between the IFB and the Southern Baptists. It's just that maybe they're accused of being more legalistic sometimes and things like that. Is that fair?
Justifiably so. But yes, the IFB, of course, is not, or at least the wing I was in, was not too fond of the Southern Baptists. They viewed the Southern Baptists as liberals, and there were a lot of other choice terms that got thrown around. But yeah, we were young Earth creationists, King James onlyist, the whole nine yards. And so, yeah, I was the only boy from child in my family. So like all my sisters always had to wear, like ankle length skirts. Well, they weren't always ankle length, but they always had to wear skirts. And, rock and roll music was bad. Never could go to movie theaters. Dancing was sinful. So we might.
When you say rock music was bad, do you mean just in principle that genre is bad regardless of content?
Yes, that was very much the position on it. In fact, when I asked about it, like what exactly was bad, it was funny that like a lot of the people just didn't have like basic understanding of like a philosophy of music. So they would be like, well, it's the beat. The beat is bad. But every song has a beat. Like that's just the tempo. It's more pronounced. Perhaps in like a contemporary worship song than it would be in like a hymn. But the beat is there in both songs. The tempo doesn't change. It's just more pronounced in one than the other. But no, I mean, they told me everything from that the tempo could call up demons to that it's associated with like sexual immorality and demons and things like that. But yes, they didn't like anything that had a very pronounced tempo to it as far as music was concerned.
Oh, I had a guy tell me once when I was pastoring that one of the parents, the youth group had some band playing, and it was like maybe more heavy than what I like even. But the dad was out there telling me, those notes, man, those notes are evil. And I'm thinking, notes are evil? What in the world does this mean? But so you came out of that background. What happened?
Yeah, well, let's see. So I was homeschooled, kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to, I guess, the world outside of my little, IFB circle, outside of like maybe family, because my family on both my dad's and mom's side are not IFB. So they were more Baptistic, like Baptist-ish, but not as extreme on my dad's side. And then on my mom's side, it was all a more like very traditional Protestant, Dutch Reformed kind of background. So they were Christian on both sides, but it wasn't IFB. So that was kind of really my only contact with anything that was not IFB. So yeah, there wasn't like, I didn't experience the world beyond that until I turned 16 and I got my first job. And then I felt kind of like I was just thrown into the wider world. And so inevitably, I would meet people, make friends, talk with coworkers. And
wait a minute. What was the first job? Was it Dillard's?
No. First job was actually a store that was called A&P. I don't believe it exists anymore, but
okay. But I'm sure it's like Dillard's. It's a Castner Knott or a Macy's or something like that.
It's more of a supermarket, but it's retail. It's retail.
The reason I'm saying this for those that don't know is because a well-known theologian somewhat cast aspersions on Pallmann's work because he's just a guy that works at Dillard's.
Oh, yeah. Well, I assume we'll get to that.
Oh, sure. I didn't know that was going to be a part of the grand story. You go right ahead. Don't let me get in your way.
No, you're good. I thought that would probably come up when we talked about how I was able to read so much, because you wouldn't believe how laid back Dillard's is. But without getting ahead of myself, so I encountered other people, and people had different ideas and kind of the stock answers that I'd been given to objections, and maybe objections even to people who believed in evolution or something. They kind of didn't sound as good when I was giving them to people who actually held these beliefs as sort of how I was hearing them from behind the pulpit or in Sunday school or stuff. A lot of the answers I had just didn't seem to work out in the real world. So things probably began, it was little things at first, but people would just like ask me, well, like, why are there two different genealogies for Jesus, right? One in Matthew, one in Luke, and they're not the same. So it was just little things like Bible contradictions, or apparent Bible contradictions, and these sorts of things just made me start questioning some of the things that I'd been taught. And I was kind of terrified at this point to really express any doubt, because in the IFB, questions are just they're not smiled upon, or I should say questions that sort of go beyond the surface level. Like, they're kind of ready for that first level of questions, but when you start questioning the answers they give you, then they start suspecting you've got an attitude problem, or you're, how do they put it, not being receptive to what they're teaching you, or something like that. But yeah, so if you really wanted to go deeper than that, they do not like that in the IFB. But I wanted to. I just kind of wasn't satisfied with some of the answers I was getting, but I didn't really want to like tell my parents about it at this point, because I was supposed to be the pastor's kid, and I'm not supposed to be doubting the faith. So I very much felt like these were questions I shouldn't be asking, but sort of almost against my will was asking.
Well, hold up on that point, because I was going to ask you, or I was just going to point out that this shows that what many atheists will say about their deconversion, for lack of better terminology, is absolutely true. There are some churches where questions are not appreciated, and it sounds like when I'm listening to you talk, what I have heard from some atheists about how they're fine with you asking questions so long as you end up landing on agreement with them in the end, And so I haven't had as much of that experience in church life, but I'm listening to you talk, and so it demonstrates that's out there.
Yeah, and it's very much harder when you're in kind of denominations that add a lot of extra stuff on top of what we might just call sort of mere Christianity, right? It's not like just believe that God exists, believe that Jesus was resurrected, believe that the Bible's the Word of God. On top of that, right, we had all kinds of rules and stuff, like, again, like music standards, dress standards, and things like that. And it was all presented as sort of this all or nothing sort of thing, so that like if any part of this was not true, then like none of it was. So there's this very all or nothing, or sort of house of cards approach that I would say I was raised with. And so there was like a real fear of letting any part of it go, even what we might consider like peripheral stuff, like the King James Bible or something like that. But eventually my dad did get to sort of the point that I had to sort of let my parents know about it. At this point I was questioning the existence of God. Why am I believing the Bible in the first place? And some of the stuff in the Bible doesn't really seem to make sense. It was kind of funny is as I started thinking more critically about things, some moments like I'd feel like despair, and I would try to turn to like read the Bible for comfort, and I would just get more questions from reading it. Answer a fool according to his folly, answer not a fool according to his folly. We got a contradiction right here. Like, I can't just read through the Bible without having like my doubts intensified. That was just how I felt at the time. So my parents, bless their heart, gave me Ken Ham's book Evolution, The Lie, to read, and Josh McDowell's book Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I really didn't like either book that much. And
you didn't have did you not have an initial time where you were a stand for Ken Ham or something?
I mean, so we had all of these Answers in Genesis magazines, or I think just the magazines called Answers, and they were all stashed up in my room. And I did for a while try to like read through those and really convince myself of younger.
That was your comic book collection. That was like your comic book collection.
That was pretty much right. I also had a few other comic books, but yeah, they were all like the Disney, the DuckTales ones. That's what those were my comic books.
That is such a weak sauce comic book collection. I've got the DuckTales comic book collection.
I believe it. That was just that's what my parents got me to read in the way of comic books.
Hey, maybe that's a rare item. Pay for your future kids' college or something. Go ahead.
Maybe so. We'll see. Time will tell. But So yeah, I wasn't a big fan of those books. And in fact, in some ways, those intensified my doubts because I was thinking, well, if these are like, this is the best Christianity can do. And remember, Ken Ham is like the premier Christian apologist for kind of my denomination, the IFB. Ken Ham was a bit more highly regarded there than we might say he is in the apologetics world at large. And so I was thinking, if these are really like, if this is the best that we've got, like, this is not really very good reasons to be a Christian. I was pretty miserable during a lot of this time too, because I really did want to believe, and I just feel like I didn't have good reasons to believe. Honestly, to the point that like I was pretty constantly depressed at this point in my life. At one point, for a while, I was actually even suicidal. Is like how bad my doubts got for me. But
wow,
at my job, yeah.
You're saying that let's give that some space, because what you're saying that like the experience of doubt, the experience of this level of doubt, especially given your spot, kind of as I'm the pastor's son and all this, it was so dark. It was to the point that you were thinking about suicide. And was daily life just was this constantly on your mind all day long?
It was, and there were other things going on as well. So, for example, I was working 2 jobs at this point in my life, and one of them was like a really early morning job. So, and the other one was kind of late, so I wasn't getting a lot of sleep. And so, I didn't know this at the time. I would later learn, though, that like if you're not getting enough sleep in life, that kind of makes you overall less rational, less emotionally stable, and things like that. And so, no doubt that was also playing into it. But also I didn't have access to the internet at this time in my life because that was another, no thing. So I felt very alone at this time because I wasn't like able to like just look up a video on YouTube or an article or something that would address some particular question.
Is this 16 years old? 16?
This is probably at this point when the doubts have really intensified. We're probably more like 17, 18.
So at 17 or 18 years old, you don't have internet access?
Yeah, no, except for through like I could go to my local library and get it there, or I could ask one of my parents to go through one of their computers. But I was pretty much only allowed to do that for like to check my email and things like that.
Wow.
As far as like just accessing the web, generally that I wasn't allowed to do that. So I didn't really have access to the internet world of apologetics. I was just sort of limited to what was sort of in my church library or what I could get out of my local library. Where I did begin to connect with what we might consider the apologetics world at large was actually through my job at the A&P. It was a grocery store, but they did have like this little tiny movie section where they would like sell DVDs. And like one shift, I had gotten there a little bit early because me and all my sisters were working at the same store, and we didn't all have our own cars, so it was just my dad had to make trips here. So he would try to combine, right? If like my sister was working an hour before me, then like he would just drop us both off the same time, and I'd wait an hour, right? So yeah, I was waiting to clock in, and I remember just looking through the DVDs that were there, and there was this one called The Case for Christ with this big name Lee Strobel on it. And so I was kind of reading the back of it, and it looked like it was going to argue for Christianity. So I went to my local library, got that DVD out of there, and that's kind of, it was like a documentary version of his book, so I kind of got it backwards. I watched the documentary before I read the book, but one of the people in the documentary who kind of caught my attention was William Lane Craig. And so I checked out his work and, through him. And also I eventually got Strobel's book, who introduced me to a lot of other people from there. That's kind of how I got into the apologetics world. And then just sort of reading on from there, I came to believe that the Christian faith was reasonable and true. And so here we are today.
Yeah. Was it the Case for Christ that initially allayed your concerns or satisfied some of the concerns, or was it when you went and found Craig and others?
Yeah, no, the Case for Christ definitely didn't do it on its own, but what it did do for me is it showed me that there was like a world of people out there that I didn't even know about that was addressing the sorts of questions that I was asking. So, I mean, Craig's book, it did, or sorry, Strobel's book did answer some of the questions that I
Yeah.
had, but it presented a whole new way of looking at it for me. So previously, I'd kind of had this idea that, like, I have to, know that the Bible is the Word of God, biblical inspiration, because that's what everything hung on to me, is I believe it's in the Bible, and I believe the Bible because, it's divinely inspired. The Lee Strobel's book kind of turned that around for me and saw I could do it the other way. I could at least look at these as like, let's just pocket or bracket divine inspiration, look at them as what they unquestionably are, which is ancient documents. We can assess the historical reliability of that. If they're true, we would have reason to believe in the resurrection, and that would give us a reason to believe in Jesus, which would give us a reason to believe in the inspiration of the Bible. That was probably the hardest thing, was probably kind of turning it upside down the way I'd been looking at it. But I mean, that ultimately worked out for me, because when I did sort of take that more historical critical approach to the Bible, I discovered, hey, there really are good reasons to believe it's historically reliable, independent of whether it's divinely inspired.
What was
So
the
yeah,
first big doctrinal shift that you had?
okay. It's so I was reading a book called Cold Case Christianity by
Heard of it?
yeah, J. Warner Wallace, and in that book, I think he has a chapter. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it's called Separating the Artifacts from the Evidence. And in that chapter, he brings up this issue of, parts of the Bible that were kind of added into it later. What we might call, he calls them artifacts in the book. So this is, stories like John 8, the woman caught in adultery, right? 1 John 5:7,
Second half
last
of
12
Mark
chapters of
16.
Mark. Right,
Yeah.
right. Stuff that's very well known to people who are in this, but this was not well known to me at the time. So this was actually scandalous to me, because I'm reading somebody who I'm trying to have encourage my faith and strengthen it, and what he's telling me is that these parts of the Bible, remember, I'm a King James onlyist, that these parts of my Bible, this is the only good Bible, right? All the other Bibles are perversions. These are from the
Right.
devil. This is what I've been taught. And he's telling me that
Or
these
the
parts.
English speaking world.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, for the English-speaking world. And you have to go back to the Textus Receptus if you want to translate into any other language. But yeah, so that was kind of scandalous to me at the time, that like, oh, he's like, this is someone who's supposed to be a Christian, but he's telling me that there's these parts in the Bible that, like, I can't believe. But as I kind of studied that out, like, it's like even King James onlyists were admitting, well, yeah, these aren't in our oldest manuscripts, but those were the corrupted manuscripts. So this kind of stuff, it checked out that it wasn't in the oldest manuscripts. And so King James onlyism, what I'm getting around to here, was saying that was something that begun to come into question for me, because it became evident to me that if I was going to continue being a King James onlyist, I could not believe in the textual reliability of the Bible anymore, because the textual manuscripts, well, basically what we would be saying is that our earliest and oldest manuscripts were all corrupted. And the only manuscripts that preserved God's word purely are, these late ones that we got the King James Version from. And so it came down to a fundamental dilemma. Either I can believe in the textual integrity of the Bible and abandon my King James onlyism, or I can maintain my King James onlyism, and just believe that for some reason, without any textual, reason for it, I have to believe these late manuscripts are the ones that God preserved. So that's when King James onlyism began to slip for me.
And I imagine there were a lot of conversations with your dad during this time.
Yes, there were. He had quite clearly been several years since he had looked into it. At the time I was bringing up the questions with him, and I love him, but he was not ready to have that conversation. And yeah, I mean, what it all started coming down to was the textual evidence just didn't matter. He started using arguments like, well, the King James is the Bible that God used to bring all the great, revivals in America and stuff. It's true, but God can, draw a straight line with a crooked stick, right? It doesn't.
Sounds
That doesn't.
familiar.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything to the textual evidence or the textual problems with like these particular passages that are in the New Testament. That doesn't suddenly put them in older manuscripts. The fact that God used this one. So I mean, yeah, I just I couldn't hang on to King James onlyism, and so that was probably the first one to go for me.
Did you feel when you finally let go of that? Did you feel kind of, because this is a strange thing. When I have moved on positions, and when I first moved on a couple of positions early in my 20s, there was a lot of anxiety, but then there was like a sense of a little bit of liberation once you did it. That you feel there's a sense of, and you shouldn't do it you shouldn't change positions just to feel this sense of liberation, but there is something to that. You feel like, hey, and maybe for some people a little bit of, and I'm the guy that was able to do it, And I think so when I hear this kind of thing, when I think about my own experience with changing views, I understand why even some, when we're talking about, say, unbelievers, that there is a sense of there's some gratification once you move, that you feel like you progressed in a serious way, and there's a little bit of, hey, I'm kind of proud of myself about that. And I think what that can do sometimes is we go haywire with changing views all over the place. I was wondering if at some point you wanted to speak to that, because I remember a chart that you released, and I think this was a popular thing at the time, where people were putting all the views they've changed on, and you had like 10 views or something that you had moved on. Did you get into it? Yeah. Did you become a view changing addict there for a little bit?
Well, I certainly didn't try to be. So, and there's a reason for that, is that I, partially because of this faith crisis I was having, my parents had this Independent Fundamentalist Baptist college that they wanted me to go to. I put off going to that, for a year. Like when I was 18 is when I was supposed to go. And I wasn't ready. I wasn't even sure if I could call myself a Christian at that time. When at the time I was 19, I was a little more solid on some things, so I was able to go, but they had a very strict doctrinal statement that the students had to sign every year and agree to. And so this is why I really had a hard time trying to, change views, is like there was external pressure on me not to do it. But some things, like, they just were really vague on, like the IFB is not good with precision. So like I could think of ways to interpret some of these doctrinal statements in ways that would allow me some flexibility, so I could technically sign that I agreed with them. But obviously, that could only get me so far. So yeah, I mean, young earth creationism, I held on to it for a while because I had to attend the school, but I stopped holding it like dogmatically. I started like saying, well, maybe there's some room for disagreement on the age of the earth. Maybe the Bible's not, super specific about it. Honestly, I don't really think the Bible cares that much about it, but I'll still be a young earth creationist because I have to be. But yes, once I was no longer attending the school, then I was, free to change that. So I did change several of my perspectives. I went from sort of a premillennial dispensationalist eschatology over to I don't like calling it a partial preterist eschatology, but an orthodox preterist eschatology.
That's exactly what Chris Date says. Chris Date's all the time saying, I wish people would just let it be preterism. It's not fair that we have to say partial preterism when we're not the ones speaking heresy.
He's right. And speaking of Chris Date, he was influential in moving me from the eternal conscious torment position on hell. I moved over to an annihilationist perspective on things. So, I mean, once it was pretty clear that I was no longer going to be in the IFB, then I did become something of a view changer. But part of that was because I now had the liberty to change on a lot of things that I had been studying up till that point and just kind of wasn't allowed to change on because of my circumstances in life.
Yeah. Wow. So were you ever, I wouldn't imagine so in the IFB, but were you ever a Calvinist?
No, no, the IFB is rabidly anti-Calvinist. I was a Molinist for a while.
Yeah, I just heard
But
you say on a debate that you don't, that you're not a Molinist. And I think some other time that might be a really fun thing to talk about. But I'm sure that you probably have looked into the soteriology debates, haven't you?
yeah, I shifted on the once saved, always saved thing. So this
Mm-hmm.
is the IFB was very big on once saved, always saved. They were non-Calvinists, other than that, but they did believe in eternal security.
Same with the
Uh,
SBC.
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this was it's kind of an interesting story. So this is while I was still at school, or at that school, the Independent Fundamental Baptist school. One of the professors there, who I continue to this day to, I enjoy him. He was my hermeneutics professor. In the hermeneutics class, he had an extra credit assignment that the students could do, where he wanted them to offer an exegesis of Hebrews 6, 1 through 6, probably one of the best known passages in the eternal security debate. So I decided to tackle that. Not that I needed the extra credit, but I was interested in tackling that. And my own research on that was really leading me away from the doctrine of eternal security. And I kind of voiced that concern with my professor. I was like, what happens if I end up with an interpretation of this passage that's out of agreement with the school? And he said he's not gonna. He said he won't grade based on content. He was just interested in seeing if I was applying the tools that he taught me throughout the class.
Good.
And so by the end of the time I wrote that paper, I actually did conclude that the conditional security reading was the best interpretation of the passage, even though I hadn't rejected eternal security yet at this time. I basically thought, yeah, this passage is contradicting it. And I turned in that paper, and true to his word, the professor did not grade me based on content, fortunately. So I didn't get thrown out over it. But
Fantastic.
that was another thing that switched for me.
Yeah. So in the midst of this, you're taking in all of this apologetics content, and you ultimately, are you aware that there are different apologetic methodologies? Because for those that don't know, one of your biggest, and maybe you're coming to this later, but one of your biggest, one of the things that people know you the most for online is speaking out against a particular apologetic methodology, of which there are several apologetic methodologies, generally speaking. And did you even know that at this point?
Let's see. I discovered apologetic methods while I was in probably my second semester of college. I was just ordering every book I could find on apologetics, and I found this book called Five Views on Apologetics. And I was like, what's that about? Apologetics is apologetics. And so, yeah, I got that book, and I was like, oh, so there's different ways of doing this. And so, yeah, John Frame wrote the chapter on presuppositional apologetics, and it was clear to me at the time I read that. I was like, this guy is defending circular reasoning. I know that's a fallacy. This is not for me. I just kind of
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, David, he says, by the way, people ought to get that book, because if you want to see Gary Habermas and William Lane Craig interact on differences they have, that's one of the only places I know, and it's fun. And then, but yeah, I think Habermas takes Frame to task on that. Says something like, "Well, that's circular reasoning." Well, yeah, it's circular reasoning, but it's not viciously circular. And then he begins to talk about, and Frame says something like, "Well, all of us have to engage in circular reasoning," which I know is something you really don't agree with or don't like as a guy who's into epistemology from a particular persuasion. But he says, well, every one of us has to do circular reasoning at some point. And Habermas says, well, there's a difference between circular reasoning about my existence or the existence of the external world versus the truth of the Bible and the Trinitarian God and all these other things, right? That's a great book. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, yeah, that was where I first discovered that there were different apologetic methods. My can I use the word hatred? My hatred for presuppositional apologetics was actually born out of interactions with actual presuppositionalists. While I was in college, I met a girl who I liked, and she was on Facebook, so that was kind of my motivation for actually starting my Facebook page, is I wanted to send her a friend request, and obviously that
Praise God for that girl.
That relationship didn't end up working out, but that was why I got on Facebook in the first place. And so, of course, I joined, the theology groups that I could find and the apologetics groups. And I was like, there are for real people who believe that circular reasoning is just fine and that you can't avoid it and that we all do it. And this just struck me as so wrong then. So people pointed me to this character named Seitan Bruggencate. I was watching his videos. And for all the stuff I throw at the presuppositionalists, I probably do owe my interest in epistemology to them more than anyone else. Because, Seitan Bruggencate would, ask, well, how do you know your reasoning is reliable or things like this? Why do you believe that you exist? He was asking a lot of these questions that I hadn't really been forced to ask at that point because, no one else just really asked them. So he did force me to kind of come to terms with, okay, well, how do I really have a method of knowing? And so that's what I knew that presuppositionalism was not it wasn't the way to go, but it did spark my interest in, okay, but these are some important questions that I think are worth having the answer to. And so that's kind of how my interest in it was born.
Is this a good time to ask you for the best argument against presuppositionalism?
Well, you can. So,
what's the best argument against presuppositionalism?
So I was gonna make two. So, but the two different types. So, there's. So I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the distinction between an undercutting defeater and a rebutting defeater, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, for those who maybe aren't, so defeaters are kind of reasons for believing that something is false. That's kind of the technical epistemological term for that. And they can come in two types. You can have an undercutting defeater, and that's a type of defeater that removes your justification for believing some proposition to be true. So kind of whatever reason that a person might have for believing it, undercutting defeater takes that away. But notice that doesn't necessarily mean the proposition is false, right? It could still be true. It just means you can't believe it, or you can't believe it on the basis of the reasons that you were giving for it. Alternatively, there's what's called a rebutting defeater. And a rebutting defeater is a reason that you give somebody to think that this proposition is false. And you can do that by way of giving them something else to believe is true, or showing it's a contradiction or something like that. Those would be species of rebutting defeaters. So I think you can argue against presuppositionalism in both sorts of ways. So on the negative side of it, by way of giving an undercutting defeater to presuppositionalism, I'm a big fan of a philosopher named Barry Stroud. Now he kind of in the, I want to say this is the mid 1900s, so mid 20th century is when he was big. There was a lot of talk about transcendental arguments, and people who know about presuppositionalism will know that's the presuppositionalist argument. And I should hasten to add, you can use transcendental arguments for theism without being a presuppositionalist. There's a very particular transcendental argument that they call the transcendental argument. And that, of course, can be cashed out in a whole bunch of different ways. But the basic problem with transcendental arguments that Barry Stroud identified is that these arguments don't actually tell you anything about what's actually the case. They can only tell you pretty much what you have to believe or how you have to think. So the presuppositionalist argument is going to be something like, well, if you don't believe in the Christian worldview, then you're not going to have any reason to believe that anything is true. You won't have justification for any of your beliefs. So you have to believe that Christianity is true in order to get all these other things that you want. But the problem with that Stroud would be pointing out is that doesn't actually matter. That doesn't tell you that the Christian worldview is true. It only tells you, even if the argument works, that you have to believe it in order to believe in something like logic, induction, the reliability of your memory, whatever else the presuppositionalist wants to bring up. And I haven't ever seen a good presuppositionalist response to Stroud on that front. I think the other way you can do it, though, and this is the way I myself have preferred to argue against presuppositionalism, is just by meeting kind of the demand that they want to put on, well, they would say the non-Christian worldview, which is really the non-presuppositionalist worldview. But if you are sort of not going to presuppose Christian theism, how do you get logic, induction, knowledge? How do you get these sort of facets of your worldview? And so that's sort of what I've tried to do, is show that actually there's a solution to the problem of induction. There is a way to know that logical laws are true. There is a way of knowing things, and you don't have to presuppose Christian theism to do it. Instead, we can use these tools to infer that Christian theism is true. And so that's been my own approach to.
Well, let's get right to the heart of that issue. So with the first one, you're saying this you could do an undercutting defeater, but here you're actually trying to respond by showing how you can have this sort of knowledge. And so let's just get right to it. Most people would say, or we hear this a lot anyway, that I think, therefore I am, right? And so people say, well, at least I can know that. I can know that Cartesian point at least with absolute Cartesian certainty. But then, of course, comes along somebody else who says, hold on, but now you're trusting your reasoning abilities. And how do you know you can trust your reasoning abilities to arrive at that? And you have a great answer to that I heard not too long ago. I'd like to hear you, because isn't that kind of the point we got to get to in providing some reason to believe that you can know something with that level of confidence?
Yeah. So the issue here is that I want to ask, what do we mean by reasoning, right? So people will often, Seitan Bruggencay especially, will like to say, well, how do you know that your reasoning is valid, for example? Well, that's a bit of a problematic question, because validity, strictly speaking, refers to arguments. It refers to a syllogism that is logically valid when the conclusion follows from the premises. So it's arguments that are valid. It's not really reasoning that's valid. Now, to the extent that we're saying that reasoning tracks an argument, we could say that your reasoning follows a valid structure. So we could loosely say your reasoning is valid. But in a technical sense, validity is it's a property of propositions and the relations that hold between them. It's not a property of your reasoning. Or maybe they'll say, how do you know your reasoning is reliable? But in epistemology, reliable refers to a source of belief, one that produces true beliefs more often than it produces false beliefs. Reasoning is not a source of beliefs. Reasoning doesn't produce beliefs. It may show us the inferences that are necessary to believe something, or that show us that a conclusion is rational, but reasoning itself doesn't produce beliefs. So it's also problematic to ask, how do you know your reasoning is reliable? That's predicated on a category error. So what do we mean by reasoning exactly? Well, I think that this is just our process of making inferences. If I'm making inferences, I am reasoning. Now, philosophers will make a distinction, at least those who are foundationalists, will make a distinction between inferential and non-inferential beliefs. So if your belief that you exist, for example, is non-inferentially justified, as I would maintain that it is, it's not based on reasoning. Reasoning is when I'm making inferences up from my non-inferential beliefs. My foundational beliefs.
Would you not say, okay, I think, so I infer that I exist?
So that's not really the way I mean, that's one way of putting it. I think it was Bertrand Russell who pointed out, strictly speaking, if that's meant to be an argument, it's technically question begging, because you're putting yourself, the I, in the first premise. So you're saying I exist, therefore I am. I do think that misses Descartes' point, though, with the cogito. The way I would put it is I would say I am acquainted with the fact that I exist. Mm-hmm. So it's not.
And you would say direct acquaintance, right?
Yeah, I mean, acquaintance is direct by, like, I would just define it in such a way that it is direct. But yeah, to make that point clear, we could say direct acquaintance, and both of those terms appear in the literature. They're equivalent, acquaintance and direct.
And basically what you would say here, just to make it as clear to the audience, is you're saying that when we get to that point, there's just you don't go any deeper than that. That's it, right?
Right. I'd say reasoning itself is talking about reasoning from other propositions. And so this proposition here, that I exist, is not being justified by an inference. It's not being justified by reasoning. It's being justified by my direct awareness of the fact that I exist. I'm aware of that fact. I'm aware of the fact that I have, a visual perception of Braxton Hunter right now. These are non-inferentially justified
Praise
beliefs.
God.
They don't depend. They don't depend on reasoning. So that's why I would say I'm actually not depending on my reasoning for the justification for those non-inferentially justified beliefs.
Now, if we move on from discussing presuppositionalism, did you get to say everything you wanted to say? Do you feel good now?
I don't know if I ever get to really say everything I want to say about presuppositionalism, but we better move on to keep the episode of a manageable length.
Yeah. Maybe the itch got scratched for you, at least for a while there. But so here's the thing. What a lot of people know about you who do not watch video content, but perhaps your stuff comes up in their Facebook feed, is that, I don't know, 5 times a day you drop a 700-page book you just read. And so obviously the fact, maybe because you were prevented from, because you didn't have access to the internet or whatever, you didn't get to do that. You didn't get to flex those muscles in the way you wanted to. And now that you've got a way to do that, maybe that leads to, I just have this thirst for knowledge and learning, and I want to bang out my worldview and get it right. And so I'm going to work on this all the time. But how in the world does one read as much as you apparently read?
Okay. So I get asked this question probably more than any other question. And the thing is, I don't feel like I read that much to be, I keep
you think you're better than us. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just saying my own perception of it is that, I read, several pages a day. Like, I have my goals and my quotas to read, and I'll get to that in a minute. But like when I'm doing it, I don't feel like this is something I'm doing is like unreasonable or something that is like this feat. It just it could be that I'm used to it at this point, or that I just enjoy it. Part of it, at least, is going to be my mom is able to read really fast. Like, she chugs through books. She's got stacks of books. My dad, by contrast, is a very slow reader. I clearly have inherited my mom's ability to read a bit faster than average. So some of it is, I'm just going to say, genetic. But part of it also...
You just got the good genes, man. You got the good reading genes. And also another thing maybe we could say is, at least currently, you're not a married man with kids, right? But you do work a lot.
Not yet. Yes. But yes, another thing is, my job. I at Dillard's, you wouldn't believe how laid back it is sometimes. I work in the back, and when there's just nothing to do, they have a certain amount of hours they have to schedule people for, or they can't use these hours. So even when there's nothing to do, I will still get scheduled to be there. But there's not going to be anything to do unless I get paid to do something. So I can just bring books with me, and for an hour or two of my shift. Sometimes, not every day. There are busier days, but sometimes I'm able to just get paid to read as well. So that's one plus of my job.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
Honestly, it is. I do appreciate that. That's one benefit of working at Dillard's. So for anyone who wants to get paid to read, go apply at Dillard's.
Dillard's Theological Seminary.
That's what we're calling it.
Well, I know you have more to say about that, but you're not. So, ever since I figured out that I could use the visually impaired features on my phone to let it read books that aren't audiobooks to me in a robotic voice and at whatever speed I like, I have really made use of that. But you're not doing that. You're just reading books, right? You're just reading eyes on paper.
Yeah, I just retain better that way. I don't like reading PDFs. I don't like ebooks. I don't like listening to my books, because I have much better retention if I just read paper, off of a paper page. And for people who can retain as well off of PDFs or ebooks or whatever, I say more power to you, because they're cheaper to get that way. They're easier to store, especially when you're moving. Oh my goodness! But yeah, it's for me. I have to have an actual book. That's the way I retain my information. And like, I don't want to read it just to read it. I want to retain it. So it just makes sense for me to actually read off the page. But a couple
Yeah,
other
go ahead.
ways. Sorry, yeah. That I will be able to read a lot is by reading multiple books at a time, because sometimes I'll be reading one and I'll just kind of get bored with it. So if you've got 3 or 4 books that you're reading at a time, and they should be on like different topics and maybe at different levels of expertise, because if you're reading a really dense tome, you don't want to read another dense tome. But maybe like if I'm reading a dense book on the synoptic problem or something, maybe I'll see an introductory book on free will, which maybe I haven't studied as much. So maybe I will can kind of get into another field of study and read a book that will be a bit more appetizing to me at that time. So
That's
vary
a good
up the
idea,
book.
because when I read, I can read for a while, but especially if it's at night, man, I can start dozing off reading. And so having different books that I can switch out, and that might be a really good, I think I might do that. Yeah. So do you want to talk about one thing you had something else to say. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just say a couple other tips.
Yeah.
Reading in the morning. I used to try to read at night. At the end of the day, that's the worst time to do it, when your mind's trying to go to sleep. Right after you wake up, that's when your mind's the freshest. That's the best time to read. And then also just set goals for yourself. Even if you just want to start with I'm going to read 10 pages every day, you can increase that 20, 30, 40, 50 pages a day. However much you want to do, but set a goal that you're just going to consistently read a certain amount. Even if it's a small amount, over time, that adds up. So those are some of my tips.
Yeah. So now that you're taking in all this stuff all the time, and you're able to drink from a fire hose, basically, what is there anything you were raised? I mean, I'm sure your parents are great parents that love you and all that, but is there anything from that upbringing in that particular sort of environment of the the IFB, Independent Baptist churches? Is there anything about that that you carry into your thinking now or your study now that you actually think was a good thing, a byproduct of how you were raised in that particular denomination?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot. There's a lot in my upbringing that I'm, am grateful for, despite having, disagreements on some of the content of it. In particular, I think I'm really grateful for kind of the ethic, or the work ethic, that my parents instilled in me. Because as I see more people my age, just at the job or whatever, it's amazing to me that people nowadays do not like to work, and this is something that my parents taught me to do, and I'm thankful for that.
Yeah.
Trying to be as just as honest and as possible with ideas. Honesty is something that my parents really drilled into me, because I had problems with it when I was younger. I was a terrible liar. But I mean, I
You
don't
mean
lie.
you weren't good at it, or you just did it a lot?
Oh, I just did it a lot. Lying was that was kind of my pet sin that I had to get over. But yeah, no, that wasn't tolerated at all. So I do appreciate my parents teaching that to me, and I've tried to carry that into my studies, is to try to be as honest with myself, and with even when I'm disagreeing with someone, try to see things from their perspective.
Sure.
I'm sure I fail at it sometimes, but I do make the effort, or I try to. There was something else I wanted to say, but I'm blanking on it. But yes, there are some things that I'm thankful for.
Well, maybe it'll come up when I ask you this, and maybe this is too personal, but when you made this move, or these moves, and it was clear that in certain respects, though not the mere Christian respects, you were kind of departing a little bit from how you were raised. Did this hurt friendships? Did you have anybody get mad at you, or how did that go interpersonally with people?
Yeah, so let's see. Let's return to the point right before I went to college. Pretty much the only thing I had shifted on officially at that point was King James onlyism. And I think my parents were aware of that, but I got sent off to the IFB college anyway. And when I was there, I tried to immerse myself in the studies that I had, but also in my own studies. And so things like I really began growing in my own thinking and my ideas while I was in college. And I think my parents weren't really aware of how many changes were going on. But clearly the school was. So from pretty early on, I was established as somebody who wasn't going to believe something just because a teacher said so, a professor said so. So that got me something of a reputation as a troublemaker. So I ended up in, my group of friends were we were kind of like the ragtag group because we were not it wasn't all for theological reasons. My best friend, who's now my landlord, but he was my friend in school. He was kind of the other guy who was had the nickname Heretic. Both of us had the nickname Heretic while we were there. But we had other friends who were just the guys who, would get in trouble because they couldn't keep their rooms clean or whatever. Just kind of the bad kids. That was the group I ended up in.
You're a real bad boy, man. You're this young Earth creationist, inerrantist who just changed on the KJV, and you were. I mean, what a rebellion!
I'll tell you, this was the reason, though, when things finally came to a head at the school. I was told I had a really bad attitude. I was not receiving what I'd been taught. I was sowing discord among the brethren. A lot of these sorts of things that
wow, bless your heart.
I call it shrouding it in pietism. And honestly, some of the charges that got me, I wasn't kicked out, but that got me ultimately ousted from there. I mean, I think some of them were just bogus charges that were completely manufactured because they needed an excuse to get rid of me. And honestly, it would have been fine if they were just like, hey, you don't agree with us on some things. We don't want you here. I really would have been fine with that. I would have preferred that to, honestly, in my view, basically slandering me to get me out of there. But of course, they were in contact with my parents about it. Told them that I was They told them that I was a problem. They didn't want me around anymore. So after this semester, I wasn't to come back unless I was, or the way it was put to me is unless I wanted to take that summer and kind of get take counseling sessions with my pastor, who was my dad, over the summer. And if at the end of that time he felt that I had sufficiently repented and would write them a letter of recommendation, then they'd consider letting me continue there. And I told them I'm not taking medication for a condition I don't have. So they didn't like that. But anyway, that was the end of my time there. So, of course, then my parents knew, because, again, I had been separated from this time. So they weren't really aware, I don't think, of how much I had been changing in that time. But, yeah, I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that the school contacted, my friends that I had back at school and told them to break off contact with me, because I had a really hard time staying in contact with most of my college friends after that. Even my girlfriend at the time then broke up with me pretty quickly after that. So, there were some sociological hardships, you could say, nothing terrible. I know people who've left the IFB and have been completely disowned by their family and stuff like that. That wasn't my story. So there are people who had it much worse than me, but yeah, there was some social stigma as a result of that.
Well, I kind of have reached the end of the stuff that I wanted to specifically ask you about, except for two things. This could be really easy. Have you ever had a experience of God that involved some sort of sense-based experience or anything obvious like that beyond what you think most Christians naturally experience?
Well, yeah, so I kind of had to ask what we might mean by senses here. Are we talking about the five senses?
I'm trying to avoid the use of the term supernatural because I know your thoughts about it. Gotcha. Yeah, so something where, I have this other podcast, Supernatural Stories, where I ask people about experiences they've had and just kind of let them talk. And I'm just wondering, have you ever had an experience that was that seemed beyond what is typical of everyday Christian experience, or heard a voice, saw something visually, anything like that?
No, I don't think I've experienced anything I could properly call like miraculous or anything like that. I've had times when I pray, or times in like worship services where I've felt like I've had a closeness with God, maybe felt the presence of God. And obviously I don't expect that to be convincing to an atheist or anything like that. So I think there are times that I've experienced God, but not probably in any way that would be unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I think for most Christians, that's probably the case. And I think there's a certain power in that in terms of relating with our fellow man or woman who happens to not be a Christian. Like Jonathan McClatchy, for example, he says, I've never had anything like that. I just have the publicly available evidence that you have that I can talk to you about. And I think there's a certain power in that, because it's you're not saying to someone, even if you don't mean to, you're not giving them the impression that you got some kind of special sauce that they didn't get, right? No, I mean, I just looked at this evidence and it convinced me, and maybe it'll convince you. I think I can show you why maybe it should, something like that.
Is that a Pine Creek term, special sauce?
Is that a Pine Creek term?
I think so. I think that's the only other person I've heard use the term special sauce.
We'll give it to him. This cup right here that I've got, one of his followers made this cup, an atheist named Uberscheiser, which I'm told means something dirty, but not sexually dirty, but just bathroom humor. And they made this, and one for Jonathan Pritchett, and on the back it says "Poof or Drown," and Pine Creek followers will know what that's about. But I drink out of it. I didn't even wash it first. I mean, if someone wanted to take me out, they had an opportunity. But no, that was not a Pine Creek reference.
Maybe they were trying to, and God did a miracle.
We can think that. We don't have any reason to. We don't have any particular reason to think that's the case, but who knows? So, okay, the reader guy who has immersed himself in all of this material because he was deprived of the internet for the most part. What are the most mind-blowing books that you've ever read that you'd say, man, I think people need to read this, and I think that it'll change the way they think about some things?
Okay, I got a really big stack of books here. We don't have to go through all of them if you don't want to. But
depending on how much time you spend on each one, and since I know you listen, you've got an engagement of sorts that I don't have coming up, so you take your time.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of books that are just really good ones. I tried to get a good conglomeration here that are like not all on the same topic, but that'll still kind of be relevant to what Trinity Radio viewers would be interested in. So,
sure. Yeah.
We'll see how helpful they're at, and hopefully they show up on the camera here. But
oh yeah,
good one. How reason
God to lead can reason how.
Yes, or that's the alternative title right there. But it's a good one on the existence of God. I recommend it to people pretty regularly because I just like that. I liked how Rasmussen anticipated like every question and objection that, at least as I was reading it, like as they came into my mind, he would address them. And then he even had like going deeper sections where you could like explore particular objections that maybe weren't like you didn't have to, like you didn't need to. It was part of his book, like wasn't part of his argument, but he had a section on it in there anyway. So I just kind of liked that aspect of the book.
Yeah, and he talks about building a bridge. He gives you this theme or this picture throughout the book of we're building a bridge because reason can actually get you further than I think a lot of people think that it can. And so we're building this bridge. And in chapter 6, he says, this bridge made of gold. And I messaged him on Facebook. I'm like, I got to chapter 6 before I figured out this bridge we're building is made out of gold. And Rasmussen's like, it's just like God. It's more amazing than you ever thought it was.
He has a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
But yes, I recommend that one often for people who like kind of want to get into it. And if you're looking to go deeper, because that one is a popular level book, his book co-authored with Alexander Proust's Necessary Existence. That's similar argument, contingency argument, but it's that's the more scholarly version. this is my kind of number one recommendation for people wanting to get into historical Jesus studies, The Case for Jesus by Brant Petrie. A lot of people don't like this one, apparently, because Petrie's Catholic. Like, I've gotten tons of flack for recommending this book. It really doesn't come out in the book at all. It's a really succinct, well-argued, up-to-date, scholarly defense kind of historical apologetics, of the reliability of the Gospels, resurrection of Jesus. It's kind of my number one recommendation for someone who's just wanting to get into it. But honestly, even if you're familiar with the territory, I think just a lot of kind of Petrie's particular illustrations and points you'll still find helpful. So that's one I liked a lot. For a bit more scholarly or dense book on a similar topic, The Jesus Legend by Greg Boyd and Paul Eddy. Here's the one that I had to grab before we started here, that I almost forgot to get. But this was called Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric by William Webb and Gordon Osteep. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. This is probably the best book I've read on the Canaanite genocide or Old Testament violence in general.
Now you say that. I do remember not too long ago you mentioned reading Randall Rouser's book on that. And speaking favorably of it, I think.
No? Randall's book, I have. He's got both a positive and a negative thesis in the book. So negatively, he wants to show that like popular, it might say like the traditional. I'm trying to think of who a representative of this view would be, but probably someone who's a Calvinist or a young Earth creationist is going to take the position that yes, God commanded them to kill, all the Canaanites just as it's described in the Bible. A very hard line approach. That, and even maybe like a more softer, like Paul Copan type approach that like, oh, well, maybe there's some hyperbole here. Randall Rouser's book spends probably the first part of it critiquing that sort of response. And I think that part he does a decently good job at. His own response is not so good because he wants to just deny the historicity of the event altogether, and just on the basis of that this kind of conflicts with his moral intuitions. And I'm like, I don't like that. Like, I don't like just picking and choosing parts of the Bible and throwing them out because they don't happen to align with my moral intuitions. The text means what it means, independent of whether I like it or not. And Rouser tries to address that concern in the last chapter of the book. You can read it for yourself and see if you think he does a very good job. I don't. So I think he does a good job showing the inadequacies of maybe some popular ways of dealing with the Canaanite genocide or Old Testament violence in general. I don't think his positive proposal is very good. And it's interesting. He does not deal with this book at all, despite the fact that it was published before his book, Jesus Loves Canaanites. And I messaged him about it, and he apparently wasn't even aware of the book's existence. So it's not a particularly well-known book, but it's very well
what's
written.
The general approach? What's the general approach to that? Would it be something like Greg Boyd and the Christiform hermeneutic and all that sort of thing?
So let's think of this as like a spectrum. We've got all the way on the very like conservative Calvinist end. The text is completely literal as written. God can do whatever he wants, and if you don't like it, you can go packing. We can soften that a little bit with Paul Copan's approach that it's basically as written, but there's some hyperbole in the text. Then on the other end, we got Randall Rouser all the way on the other extreme saying that no, this didn't happen at all. Versus maybe we got Greg Boyd saying, well, yeah, something happened, but they were misunderstanding God who communicated to them or whatever, and God wasn't really commanding this sort of thing. I would put that book right exactly in the middle. So it does adopt aspects of it does affirm the historicity of the conquest narratives. It affirms that there is hyperbole present in the text, and even goes on. It has a whole chapter defending the hyperbole thesis from objections to kind of Copan and Flanagan. That's actually a really good chapter in the book. But it also it doesn't go as far as Boyd does. It accepts that there is divine accommodation going on here, that what's represented in these ancient texts is not God's ideal, this is God accommodating, a primitive and barbaric people, ultimately to call them to a higher standard. And when compared to the practices of their day, we can kind of see that there is a redemptive movement going on here. So it does agree with Boyd that there's accommodation going on, but it doesn't go as far as Boyd does, because Boyd will actually say, well, the message could get garbled and like the people were misunderstanding God. They strongly resist Boyd on precisely that point. So I put that exactly in like the middle, and to me, at any rate, it was the most satisfactory approach of what we might think of as the 5 open options.
Well, that sounds like a fantastic choice. What else you got for us?
Read this one, I think last year, Atonement and the Death of Christ by William Lane Craig. This is honestly, I struggled with penal substitutionary atonement for a long time, and this is the book that kind of made sense of it for me. So for people who are, even if you don't affirm penal substitutionary atonement yourself, not you in particular, Braxton, I'm pretty sure that you do, but yeah, but for maybe, well, I know probably Will Hess is going to be watching this, and I know he's not a fan. Even critic or like Warren McGrew, people who don't like penal substitutionary atonement should still read it. It's probably the best defense you're going to find of it, at least from like moral sort of perspective.
But were you let down with the unbelievable episode between Greg Boyd and William Lane Craig about this? Or did you think that was a good discussion?
I was not let down by it per se.
Needed to be longer, maybe?
I thought Boyd gave up a little too quick. I was kind of hoping Boyd would put up more of a fight. This is kind of the same response I've had, is that Craig nuances the view pretty well, that it kind of just pacifies a lot of the stock objections to penal substitutionary atonement. And the response I've gotten from people like Warren McGrew, who are critics of penal substitutionary atonement, they want to say that it's not actually penal substitutionary atonement, precisely because they can't run most of their objections against it to Craig's model. Whether you think it's really penal substitutionary atonement or not, it's an interesting theory of the atonement.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. All right. What else we got?
Okay, The Legitimacy of Miracle by Robert Larmer. I don't know why Larmer's work is not better known in the apologetics world, to be perfectly honest, because his work on miracles is, at any rate from a philosophical point of view, it's really the best I've come across. He's a really good writer. He takes on David Hume's argument against miracles, and I think he just really very clearly shows some of the problems with it. He defends it against even like more recent proponents of Hume's argument. And he's got a few different books out there. A lot of them are like building on his work, so it kind of accumulates over time. This is his most recent one, so it's a bit more expensive than the other ones, but it's the most up-to-date one. So, if you can't afford it, his older books are also good ones, but this is his most up-to-date work on miracles. Personal favorite of mine, The Progressive Publication of Matthew by B. Ward Powers. If you're interested in, so it's officially about the synoptic problem, which might seem boring to some people. I find it fascinating, the synoptic problem. The book it's set to defend, the priority of Matthew. It's set to defend the Griesbach hypothesis, but he also there's a lot of good sense in the book. He defends like the traditional authorship of the Gospels. He defends the reliability of our early patristic witnesses. So even if you're not all that interested in the synoptic problem itself, maybe you don't like the Griesbach hypothesis, if you're still interested in apologetics, I think there's a lot in the book that you'd find valuable. And he's a really good writer. Like a lot of biblical scholars are very dry, boring writers. Sorry to say that, but a lot of them are. Even though it's a really long book, Powers is a really good writer, so he keeps it interesting.
Yeah. Well, I was interested to hear you argue in the debate that I watched with Leo from, I think, a month ago or something, that you mentioned, you defended, or at least you stated and were prepared to defend, the authorship by the names that we ascribe to the documents.
Yeah, and part of that is pulling on Powers' work there. So particularly on the Gospel of Matthew,
what do you think of the notion that Matthew, that basically the sayings material that we attribute to Q, is basically stuff Matthew wrote?
So this kind of depends on a few different. It really depends on how you're going to interpret Papias.
Papias,
and, Papias, and I think Irenaeus. These are our two earliest guys who they say that Matthew wrote his gospel and he wrote it. It's usually translated as Hebrew language. It could also be translated as Hebrew style. So kind of depending on where you go with that, then you might think that there is this earlier kind of proto-Gospel of Matthew. I'm open to that. Powers actually thinks that he takes a version of that view, but there are also arguments against interpreting Papias that way. Scholars like Robert Gundry and Bernard Orchard have interesting arguments that they think this is misunderstood. That this was misunderstood, and that they're just talking about our Gospel of Matthew. So I'm not completely decided myself on how to interpret the patristics on that point, but suffice to say, if there was this earlier sayings gospel, then yes, I think that it would have been written by Matthew.
Now, this could be an unpopular take, but do you affirm Mark in priority?
No, not at all. I think Mark is the last of the synoptics.
Would you say, like, okay, so what I'm seeing right now in the online apologetics realm when it comes to the resurrection and arguing for the resurrection is you have the maximal data people and the minimal facts people, and the minimal facts people are going to line up under Mike Licona and Gary Habermas and other people that have their own minimal facts cases, maybe like Craig or something. But then you have like Lydia McGrew and her, Tim and Lydia McGrew and her husband, Tim and Lydia McGrew, and Eric Manning, Jonathan McClatchy. I think these are all people that prefer the maximal data approach. And so did that influence you? Did the McGrew's work influence you in this?
As far as where I fall on the synoptic problem, no, because
the Mark in priority thing, yeah.
Well, see, the thing is, the McGrews are really reluctant they want to say that the synoptic problem is just not particularly relevant because they think we have independent evidence of independence within the Gospels regardless. So we've got, like, they admit that there is literary dependence among the synoptics, but they also think there's evidence for independence in there. So they say the synoptic problem is largely a red herring. I think there's some truth to that. But at the same time, I think there are apologetic reasons for being interested in the synoptic problem. My own interests particularly are from defending the traditional authorship of the Gospels. The big objection, all the church fathers say Matthew's first, but scholars say Mark is first. So we seem to have some reason to think that the church fathers don't know what they're talking about when they tell us that who the authors of the Gospels are, because they don't even get the order right. That's what my interest comes in defending the priority of Matthew. It doesn't really have anything.
And since you just did a debate on this and were prepared to defend I guess you were prepared to defend these Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I'd love to have you on back again just to talk about that. And if people would love to do that so I can pressure him into it, let us know in the comments. But go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, did you want me to continue talking about synoptic problem or move on to other books?
No, you can move on. What's the next book?
Okay, this one here, In Defense of Pure Reason by Lawrence Bonjour. I enjoyed this one because Bonjour is a really good writer, and it just is a defense of the idea that we can know things apart from experience, that we can kind of have what philosophers call a priori knowledge. That might be a little more boring to people, but to me, it was important at one point in my life, and I enjoyed that book. Yeah. Here's one you might like, Braxton. Agent Causation Revisited by Thad Botham. It's a really underrated defense of an agent causal understanding of libertarian free will, and unfortunately, it's a really expensive book to get, but it is by far the best development of Timothy O'Connor's agent causal idea of libertarian free will that I've read. And Botham's a really good writer too. So this is probably my favorite book on free will. And
do you feel like it satisfactorily answers, what we could call the intelligibility problem of from whence does a free choice come? That sounds like that's kind of the point.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what agent causation is
Mm-hmm.
developed kind of as a determinists kind of want to say everything is either determined or it's random, it's
Random.
chance. Like, which is it? And the agent causal theorist wants to say that's a false dichotomy. You can have this other sort of thing called an agent, and that can be the cause of a free action. And so,
And you
yes,
think, did you, because did you feel like when you finished it, you feel like, okay, I think he's right. And does it pretty well resolve it for you?
yeah. So to be clear, he is developing Timothy O'Connor's model, which was, I think the book is called Persons and Causes, and that's like a really short book that Timothy O'Connor wrote. And when I read that, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. He develops it further and defends it against objection. So that it was maybe more like confirmation to me. I think I had like that this makes sense moment when I read O'Connor's book. I was like, this really makes sense when I read Botham's book on it. So
Gotcha.
that answer.
Gotcha. Cool.
Okay, got one book by an atheist on here, Divine Intervention by Evan Fales. I don't know if you can see that. This is if you're like a Christian and you want to, or just a theist, and you want to test your faith against the best the atheists have. This is the book to read, in my opinion. For me, this was the most challenging book I ever read as a theist.
Really?
Yeah. Part of it might just be subjective to me because me and Fales, we think very much alike. We've got a sort of similar method of thinking through kind of these philosophical, metaphysical, and epistemological issues. And so a lot of what he says resonates with me. So I come to like a lot of the arguments he presents against like the intelligibility or the possibility of God as an explanation for things. They resonated with me because I'm like, oh, this is how I think about these issues. So I think I have ways around the arguments he presents in here, but I really had to work for it. Like
Does he
really,
affirm libertarian freedom?
I don't. I would be surprised if he did, but
I know, but the reason I raise it is because Tim Stratton always quotes him.
Yeah, I was just saying. Tim Stratton quoted him in his book, and so I don't actually know if he does. I would be very surprised if he does because
it is, and maybe he was just stating something that, something that he's still thinking about. But it seemed like, or I think the where Tim quotes him is with respect to Tim's thing about not being able to if determinism is true, then you can't have knowledge because the reasoning process is now deterministic or whatever. And I think he had a quote from Evan basically agreeing with that.
Yeah, I would have to check the source on that to really see. Certainly in this book, I don't ever recall him affirming it. I'm pretty sure he is a property dualist, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm pretty sure Evan Fales is not a naturalist or not a physicalist, I should say, or a fan of that. So yeah, he is a bit of an oddball as atheist philosophers go, but his arguments against theism are very formidable. I found his book more challenging than I did like Sobel's Logic and Theism or than Oppie's arguing about gods. Even though Fales' book is like a fraction of the length of those books, to me, at any rate, it was much more challenging. Back to a little bit of a theological spin. The Quest for Truth by Leroy Fourlines. I see a lot of people complain that like the Calvinists have the corner on the market when it comes to systematic theology textbooks. If you want a good non-Calvinist systematic theology, this is probably my favorite one. It's by Leroy Fourlines, was a free will Baptist theologian. And this book presents some of the best challenges against Calvinism. I mean, probably a good half of this book is spent to sort of developing an Arminian soteriology and just blasting the Calvinist one. But he does it with grace. He does it with a lot of humility and grace.
He takes a bazooka to you, but he does it in grace.
God bless you.
Is that a readable book for people that might want to just grab it? Okay.
Absolutely. And if you don't want the whole systematic theology and you just want the soteriological sections, there's an edited volume called Classical Arminianism, edited by Matthew Pinson, which just is the soteriology sections of that book. But it's very, very readable. I mean, he is a scholar, and so he is able to like engage at the high level, but it's written to such a way that it should be accessible to anyone who's
Good.
basic.
Yeah, that's good.
We just got 4 more here. The Waning of Materialism. Yep, edited by Rob Koons and George Beeler. Really good critique of kind of physicalist theories of mind and defense of kind of a dualist alternative. It's a long book, but so many of the essays in it are just so interesting. I really want to get into philosophy of mind at some point because I find it so interesting. But yeah, because like I have a lot of thoughts, but I need to develop them. I know I need to like learn the territory better. But some of the seeds of my thoughts on the problems with physicalism and some arguments for dualism, especially based on things like our ability to know, have their source in that book. So people who maybe want a philosophical-ish, I guess very philosophical book. That's a good one to go after, but yeah, not for beginners by any means. That's when you've looked at the territory for a little bit.
Well, I was wondering, would you be open ever to, or have you had a discussion with a Christian physicalist?
Are we talking about Chris Date?
Yeah.
At some point, I could. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Chris's objections or arguments would be more based in Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So I would need to study that side of the debate. It's not that I wouldn't be willing to, but I would definitely need time to prepare for that. But yeah, I mean, I love Chris, and I would definitely I'd like to discuss that with him.
Sure, yeah, it could be a discussion. Chris is one of the most formidable debaters that we've got, in my opinion, and so yeah, but a discussion could be helpful at some point. But yeah, carry on with the book tour.
Okay, this one here, I hope you can see it. Probably can't.
What does it say? Meta epistemology and skepticism? Okay.
I don't know if you can read it any better, but yeah.
Yeah,
unfortunately, this one doesn't have a slip cover on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, for those who are interested in kind of the direct acquaintance theory, it starts with Bertrand Russell, but it kind of fell out of popularity. And this book here, written by Richard Fumerton, is kind of the book that revived it and put it in, or at any rate, Fumerton's work is what revived it and kind of brought it into mainstream and epistemology again. I think this book's more like the culmination of his work, so maybe I shouldn't say this book is what brought it back. But to me, this is kind of what cracked the code of skepticism for me and was explaining, how we are actually able to know things and why we aren't, stuck, with circular reasoning and things like that. So it's pretty, dense material. But I mean, Fumerton's actually, as philosophers go, he's a pretty clear writer. He doesn't use a lot of symbolic logic and stuff. So, I mean, if you've got general familiarity with philosophy, it should be a pretty readable book to you. And at least in my opinion, those are questions worth asking.
Yeah, and when I'm trying to study something that I don't really know anything about, I just do it next to my desktop, and then I look up YouTube videos to explain a concept in a nutshell way that I've never heard before. Then I go back and read the book and say, okay, that does make sense now,
Yeah. Well, that was it. Yeah, it was just an important book for me because I guess, and I know a lot of people probably disagree with me on this, but I always had this kind of intuition that if I wasn't able to know something for certain, then I was never going to be able to get anywhere in my own knowledge because I couldn't even make a probabilistic judgment unless there was something certain to make it from. And so Fumerton, for me, provided an explanation of how it is that we can have those certain foundations. Now, unfortunately, Fumerton himself is a bit of a skeptic when it comes to making inferences. So he doesn't think that we can actually know that we're not brains and vats and stuff. He thinks that we can know with certainty that we have headaches, certainty that we have visual perception of what have you. But when it comes to getting beyond that, Fumerton himself is a skeptic. So the way I was able to sort of break out of my own head, that would be Timothy and Lydia McGrew's work. So last 2 books here, The Foundations of Knowledge by Tim McGrew and then developed further into internalism and epistemology by Timothy McGrew, and also with his wife, Lydia McGrew. This might seem like really abstract stuff, but particularly the second book, Internalism and Epistemology, that has been so relevant to my my own apologetic endeavors, because it actually helped me begin to see how like the types of arguments that were being given for certain conclusions actually supported those conclusions. It showed me like how appealing to inductive evidence of things beginning to exist, how that actually provided evidential support for the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. It answered my questions about how can I really know that the laws of logic are true without using the laws of logic and begging the question. So kind of a lot of my own skeptical angst that I had, these books actually resolved that for me and showed like, yeah, we don't just have to kind of assume some starting point and move on from that. So needless to say, of course, they've helped me in my debates with presuppositionalists. I think that they have, showed us that we don't have to just depend on circular reasoning or begging the question, but that we actually can go down to evidential, foundations, and that, we can have justification right down to the bottom. And that can really show us, the truth directedness of our beliefs. We don't just have to hope that the, perceptions that we're having are, accurate. And well, if they are, then maybe we can some way infer our way to, God and Christianity. It showed me that these beliefs that, these arguments, they actually are truth directed. Our arguments for theism, for Christianity, these actually are pointing to something that is actually true. And it explained why. And so that's why, to me, at least, these were such important books, because those are just things I worried about, right? Like maybe I would have good arguments for God's existence, but what if, deduction doesn't actually get us anywhere, right? Like what if we can't trust logic? What if we can't trust induction? What if these aren't actually ways of knowing? I mean, we assume they are. We can't really do other than that. But are they really getting us there? And allaying like these sorts of meta-skeptical issues, those were books that resolved them for me. So for me, at least, those are some of the most important books I've ever read.
Wow. Well, I know that there's at least two there that I'm going to pick up and start reading, starting with that one, Brutal, something about the Old Testament atrocities. And
Bloody,
that'll
brutal,
be, yeah. So man, that's awesome. Well, listen, man, this has been a blast. I'm really glad that our audience got to meet you if they didn't know you already. Is there anything else that you feel like really needs to be said about your story or about the use of apologetics, that God used that to bring you to a firmer faith? Anything that you want to say in summary about all that?
No, just say I appreciate, the work that you've been doing on this channel, especially your response videos to, the atheists. It's not my calling to do that because I just don't have the patience to deal with what I would consider the low-hanging fruit, the bottom of the barrel objections. But we need people. We need people who do that, and you clearly have a gift for that. So I do appreciate the work that you do on this channel.
Well, I appreciate that. That means a lot. And I'm glad we finally got to chat. But everybody go check out David's channel. That's linked in the description, as well as I've linked a couple of debates. In fact, since from their perspective, those debate links are already there, but I'm sitting here talking to you before I've put them there. So what debate, if you only had one debate to kind of showcase what you're doing, which one would that be?
Do you want me to do an apologetic one or one of my theological ones?
Let's just do one of each.
Okay, probably my favorite apologetic debate has been the recent one that I did with Leo on the Gospel Truth. It was called Does the Christian God Exist? And then probably my favorite soteriological debate is going to be Is Unconditional Election Biblical? With J.D. Martin on practical faith. I enjoyed that one as well.
Are you wearing a leather jacket in that one?
I might be. I
think I saw that one. I've watched a lot of JD stuff. And he's a libertarian, right?
Yeah, because he's a 4-point Calvinist, and they actually believe in libertarian free will.
Yeah. Okay, so that one's going to be good. And then the one you just referenced, just to whet people's appetite, I really enjoyed the section toward the beginning of the cross-examination where you and Leo began talking about whether or not he affirms like a full-blown naturalism, or whether he believes, and if he does he believe in any things that are not physical? And I just thought the way that was handled was just fantastic. I thought there was a great little interaction there with you guys.
Well, thank you. It means a lot coming from you, Braxton.
Well, I encourage people to check it out. So those are linked in the description. So now you know what you're going to watch next. You're not going to stay on this channel. You're going to go somewhere else. This is one of the only times that a YouTube channel host is going to tell you to do that. So go subscribe to David's channel and check out some of his debates. David, it's been fantastic having you here. So glad that you could come. So behind what you're doing. Proud to call you a friend. And we'll see you all next time on Trinity Radio.